Hey there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we're finally going to be talking about the newest album from Baroness called Gold and Grey. So throughout the course of my reviews, but especially in the past couple of years, I've gotten some comments surrounding how much attention I pay to the production of the albums that I review. And even beyond my lyrical or thematic criticisms, where I tend to go in deep and get pretentious about it, I'd argue that production is probably some of the least recognized part of discussing music, or at least serves as a strong differentiating factor between the casual listeners and the diehards. And you know what, believe you me, if I could just ignore bad mixing or mastering, or simply was able just to tune out where it was average instead of possibly great, it'd probably make my life as a critic a hell of a lot easier. But you know what, when you hear a project where the production approach actually matches what the artist is intending, you can find something really rare or special or beautiful or transcendent, especially if it's not overdone. It's just subtle enough where you can tell it's there, but it just works. But I'll admit the whole overdone question's a loaded one, because sometimes an album's mood and vibe is created as much by the producer as the compositions themselves, and finding the proper balance can be incredibly tricky, especially if you're taking some risks behind the production boards. Which inevitably takes us to Baroness, the veteran heavy metal act who delivered a few genuinely excellent albums and then had yet to claw their way back from near disaster to deliver the phenomenal Purple in 2015, which damn near had a shot for my year-end albums list, even as their single Shock Me absolutely made my favorite songs of that year. But one of my main criticisms of Purple was rooted in the producer Dave Fridman, who I knew most for his work with the Flaming Lips and Tame Impala, where I could respect his commitment to the massive atmospherics, but also was embracing an increasingly blocky, blown-out sound that was heavily reliant on clunky compression. And you know what, it's tough to pinpoint the exact moment where things started getting obtrusive. I'd argue it was embryonic back in 2009, but by the middle of the 2010s, it was starting to actively detract from the compositions, and did prove to be a bit of a blemish on Purple. Still a great album, but there were issues. So when a lot of the buzz around Baroness's follow-up, Gold and Grey, was linked to how the production issues were now at the forefront, with Fridman handling both the production and the mixing, and where more than just the critics were seeming to notice, yeah, that's kind of scary. But hey, you know what? It's Baroness. They're a genuinely great band. A whole lot of critics have gone head over heels for this album, and I was excited to see how their new guitarist Gina Gleason would deliver, so maybe Gold and Grey would turn out just fine? Well, okay, I need to take a slightly different tack with this review, because, much to my great disappointment, the production issues, they're here, and they're absolutely the biggest point to detract from this album in a way that's damn near unavoidable. The problem for me as a critic is that everyone and their mother has already pointed this out, with the exception of a lot of mainstream critics, bizarrely. So what I'm going to try and do is explain why Baroness thought this could possibly work, and why it fails so badly. And what's again exasperating is that there are some other problems here independent of the production, enough so that while I'm not sure I'm ready to call this Baroness's worst album, it's absolutely the most obviously flawed, and the one that I'm least likely to revisit as a whole. Spoilers, it's not that good. But you know what? Let's start with the production and ask that first question. Why was this done? I mean, I'm gonna give Dave Fridman the benefit of the doubt and argue this was intentional. He's not an incompetent producer, and his choices to blow out or compress certain pickups amidst the suffocating swells of reverb, they don't feel slapdash. If that was the case, it'd be all over the album on even songs where that approach did not make sense. And you know what, for the most part, the ballads here, they're allowed to sit in cushions of slightly psychedelic tinged reverb, and they kind of work. No, it's the points where the compression is piled onto every tone en masse like Broken Halo, or the mess of Throw Me an Anchor, which is desperately trying to make that acoustic driven hook work alongside some really solid soloing, just wish I could hear it more, or the phaser effects that are tacked onto the drums like on Cold-Blooded Angels, or a blast beat passage on Seasons that's blown out to the point where even a black metal producer would ask what in the nine hells you're even doing, or where the bass leads pick up so much grind that it clips in the mix like on Front Towards Enemy, or where the guitars are so blown out in the feedback that not only does it peak hard in the mix, it drowns out any sort of melodic tone. And when you couple it with how the vocals are rarely ever centered in the mix, they can feel increasingly claustrophobic and contorted, compressed at every side with every tone snarling for more release, You know what? I actually kind of get it. I mean, you're trying to create a suffocating Titanic atmosphere where everything is sizzling and hostile and in your face, alien and imposing, even crushing back our frontman as our protagonist, our voice in this hellish maw. And I know this because it's analogous to the same approach that Dave Fredman took on the Flaming Lips' genuinely unnerving 2013 album, The Terror, an album that was designed to alienate the audience and probably succeeded a lot more than I'd argue it gets credit. I mean, I love that album, but for very different reasons. And this is where you actually have to pay attention to the defined details. And what works for a deranged psychedelic rock band intentionally trying to piss off the audience doesn't always work for a sludgy heavy metal band that's greatest and often underrated strength is the melodies, the anthemic hooks. And the most immediate problem are dynamics. When you use such blown out effects, even if you're intentionally trying to create a mix that's drowning in its own nightmare fuel, if you don't allow the larger mix to absorb those effects, give them dramatic contrast with some cleaner elements, you don't establish context to create tension or provide a space where that isn't the norm. It's one reason why Swans doesn't just swamp out the mix in crushing heaviness, knowing that the progression is 80% of the battle in order to create the menace, the build-up, how imposing and titanic those songs can be. But even then, acts like Swans and the Flaming Lips, they don't care much these days about being catchy. If you're Baroness and you want your melodies and hooks to really cut through, as we know they can, choosing then to drown out your vocals midway to the back of the mix, tack on reverb to only further distort their presence, and then layer your lead guitar so it's more abrasive, blown out fuzz than actual melody, it only serves to weaken that power of those hooks. And that's not getting to how it compromises the flow. Considering how much work that Baroness will get out of melodic grooves driven by the bass harmony, when it's distorted to the point where it's actively clashing with the drums or the guitar lead on feedback, it doesn't allow the groove to pull the song forward effectively. So a lot of these tunes lose the ability to feel as driving, as anthemic as they want to be, instead stuck in a weird, sludgy gray zone where all the texture is there to make you think that these are crushing and impactful tones, and the playing's as frenetic and as explosive as ever, but the ability to surge, it's compromised. It all just runs together. And this is where we kind of have to bring up the structure, because if this was just a slipshod experimental EP where Baroness wanted to try the style on for a couple of tracks, that'd be one thing. But this is a double album running over an hour, complete with a fair number of instrumental interludes that have a fair amount of simmer but rarely any sort of deeper payoff. Usually it's just a minute or two of noodling on the guitars or the keyboard, or just fiddling with the production tricks to tweak the atmosphere. And that's before that badly tuned psychedelic misstep of Crooked Mile, easily the worst thing here. And then you got the ballads that, minus the compression, minus the overmixed approach, they're able to make some slightly better use of the atmosphere, which can give the impression of some inconsistent production song to song, but really just reflect using the blown out approach in the wrong places and not properly. It's not an exact comparison, but it kind of reminds me of a similar messy production dynamic that really hurt Tyler the Creator's Cherry Bomb. And you'd think that would be a comparison that Baroness would want to avoid, but it's the one I kept coming back to every time. Now here's the question. If you sift past all the production, you try to focus on the underlying compositions, that's what's going to matter when they go live. Does Baroness deliver here? Well, once you put aside how they've never quite been a lyrical band, and they aren't really here either, I mean, I'll give them credit for how much realizing how much the production creates a very claustrophobic, paranoid vibe, and thus how many of the lyrical themes will ultimately circle around paranoia, despondency in the face of being surrounded and penetrated on all sides with a very uncertain, very bleak future, be they in more literal life and death situations or relationships mid-collapse. I get the approach, it kind of makes sense, but you want to find the tunes that best complement the band's strengths. And I'll say this, if I'm actively trying to find stuff that I like about this album, which I am trying to do, there's a lot that I can say about the raw talent here. John Baizley, he can howl his lungs out with real visceral presence. The backing vocal harmonies from the new lead guitarist Gina Gleason, they're a welcome compliment, and for as much as the production doesn't really help them, for as much as they wind up clashing, I really appreciate how the drummer Sebastian Thompson, and especially bassist Nick Jost, deliver some really creative and propulsive groove passages when you can hear them properly, and when you get songs like I'm Already Gone that feel a little less overmixed, even with the whooshing drum passages and the overcompression, the grinding tune, the prominent bass cuts through just good enough to make it work. Hell, I wish I could say the same thing about Throw Me an Anchor, because from what I can hear of the lead work, it is excellent. Gina Gleason really showed out here. Hey, you know what? I will highlight the ballads that are more heavily acoustic, or leaning on keyboards like Tourniquet or Emmett Radiating Light. Yeah, they're blatant retro psychedelic callbacks hammered into Baroness's regular formula with a little bit more texture than tune, and that's another thing, a lot of the songs on this album, they could really fit onto Purple, just with worse production on this project. But while the compression is more present than it should be, there is a little bit more atmosphere overall, and the harmonies show through better. The key shifts in the solo on Tourniquet, obvious highlight, as do the thicker harmonies and twinkling keys on Emmett Radiating Light. There are moments that I could see working, or even working so much better with better production. But as a whole, look, you know what, maybe I'm wrong about this one, as there's already a pretty significant subset of mainstream critics who are praising this to hell and back and highlighting the production as boundary-pushing and experimental, as if this hasn't been rooted in Dave Fridman's approach for the past decade and has only gotten more slapdash. And I'm frankly stunned that in certain quarters, Baroness is getting as much of a pass as they are, especially for a project that does feel overlong, lacking in coherent momentum, indulgent in some awkward ways, and with every production element detracting from the album's compositional potency. But in a sense, I kinda get it, as I can see how many of these songs hitting way harder live, and Baroness is a solid enough element of modern, quasi-mainstream metal to deserve respect. But in thinking about Golden Grey, it also got me thinking about Metallica's Injustice for All, another overlong project fatally flawed by bad production, and while it got some acclaim at the time, nowadays folks look back and they can acknowledge that it sounds flat and the bass is mixed into oblivion. And while some fans are already doing that now to point out the problems with Golden Grey, and if I'm making any comparison to previous Baroness projects, sorry folks, it's a lesser work. It's getting a light 6 out of 10 from me, it's recommended for the fans, but if you've got a sharp ear for production and mixing, or you just have a better system, this album will be more frustrating than rewarding. Hey, don't say I didn't warn you. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. I'm a little bit surprised I had this much to say about this one, but the mixing really hurt this thing. I really wanted to love this, and I just don't. But hey, if you want to buy or stream it, links down there below. Got the poll up there for the Baroness fans. Tell me how wrong I am, although really with this mixing, I don't think I am. And the fans have turned on this album pretty quickly too. Beyond that, hey, if you guys actually looking to find me on any social media or facilitate discussions, leave comments, or hey, if you actually want to go over to my Facebook page, which I reactivated, you can reach me there, and links to that, Twitter, Instagram, all in the description down below. And hey, beyond that, if you're looking for where Billboard Breakdown is, my weekly web series, I talk about the inanity of the charts, where this certainly won't be, links in the card right over here. But till then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.